Let's see if we can bring up the first slide, please. Well, let me for a moment take you to the northwest Amazon of Colombia and the homeland of the Macuna and the Barasana, two of this interesting complex of people, sometimes called the people of the anaconda, because they all share the same sense of mythological origins. They all believe that they came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent, or dragged by the serpent in canoes that had the three ancestral plants, yahe, tobacco, and coca, and then they occupied unique river of the northwest Amazon. And in coming up the Milk River, they were, of course, were in the wake of the great culture heroes, the Iowa, the Four Thunders, who moved up the river, embraced and made love to Romikumu, and with that engagement brought order to the world. And so human beings for the Barasana and the Macuna are not the problem, they're the only solution, because it is a human being that alone can maintain the energetic flows of creation itself. That's what I meant when I commented that the Barasana believe that plants and animals are but people in another dimension of reality. And the shaman's role is that of a diplomat, the individual who has to go to the heart of the reactor at times to reprogram the world. They literally journey beneath the ground. One of the reasons the peoples of the northwest Amazon are so sensitive about gold mining is that they actually believe gold resides, like the luminosity of the sun, beneath the earth to guide the shaman in the journeys to encounter the Haze spirits. And the extraordinary thing about this complex of peoples is that we really believe that they are the, if not the direct descendants, certainly the upcountry cousins of the great civilizations that Aureliana witnessed in 1541, when the Amazon was not an empty place, but the home of perhaps 10 million people. And we can see, unlike the what used to be called the marginal peoples, the societies like the Kofan, the Yanomami, the Warani, who were living closer to the edges of the basin, often in open conflict with their neighbors, marrying endogenously, sort of living in isolation. These societies, by contrast, had social structures and customs that facilitated peace, not war, not the least of which was a marriage rule called linguistic exogamy that meant that you had to marry somebody who spoke a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing a distinct tongue. And those longhouses, in terms of their architectural beauty and their symbolic resonance, rival anything the Maya or the Inca ever built. And within the longhouse is the womb of the community, but hovering over the entire universe is the universal Maloca. And it's there, anchored by the sacred sites, that not just the shaman, but the entire community journeys during the great rituals. And the feather regalia is not decorative. These are literally not symbols of the sun. These are the rays of the sun. And when one places it upon you, you literally become a sacred being moving through space, in a sense, on the wings, if you will, of the divine. And when Yahe is taken, it is taken always in a collective way, almost as like a prayer for the well-being of the entire community. And in these great rituals, the men literally sort of over 2 days and 3 nights, and I'll speak about this a little bit later on in the evening during the wrap-up, literally aren't the symbols of the ancestors, they become the ancestors and they go on these extraordinary journeys. But let's just step back for a moment to just an ordinary night in a Maloca. And I know Mark's been there so many times, Glenn probably. It's one of the most beautiful spaces. And at night, the women and the children rustle off to bed, and behind you at the male end of the Maloca, you begin to hear the sounds of chanting and instruments blown, deer heads, whistles, and the beginning of the thump, thump, thump of the manufacture, the creation of Mambe, derived, of course, from Amazonian Coca. leaves that were gathered in the afternoon are slowly toasted in these ceramic vessels, and then men taking turns pounding the coca into a fine dust, adding the ashes of several species in the Cecropia genus, collectively vernacularly known as yaruma. And then when you actually get to wrap your lips around this delicious powder, you begin to feel a gentle glow in your body, a sense of well-being, and everything just seems to be about right. And you begin to understand, as Mark and I do, and Andy, why it was that our great mentor, Richard Evans Schultes, proudly chewed Mambe every day of the 12 years that he was in the Amazon. And if you get up in the morning and you walk through the forest and for the first time you don't notice how hot it is or how rough the trail is, all you do is just feel wonderful to be alive, then you can understand why he did that. And he was like a great sommelier of Mambe. He would always tell you the latest and the best variety. One of his favorites was something that Tanimuko make that I don't actually like, but it was a delicious recipe he maintained where they infused the powder with the aromatic resin and smoke of a forest tree. Schultes once pulled out a can of Mambe, as he often did actually, at a society party in Bogota, and in measured tones he told anyone who would listen that the preferred ash came from the large palmate leaves of Cecropia sciatophylla, not the decidedly inferior foliage of Cecropia peltata. He naturally had the good stuff. Well, on October 31st, 2020, WPVI Action News, an ABC affiliate in Philadelphia, led its evening news report with a sensational account of a rare drug bust at Philadelphia International Airport. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials had seized 12 pounds of what was described as green cocaine, along with a mysterious, quote, brown tar-like substance which had tested positive for nicotine. The green cocaine predictably tested positive for cocaine. According to the authorities, the green hue in the green cocaine was just a way of camouflaging the drug, which through a chemical process using gasoline, as was reported, ammonia, and other chemicals could be turned white. The implication being that ounce for ounce, it was just your ordinary blow tinged with another color. This seizure, reported Casey Durst, head of the CBP's Baltimore field office, perfectly illustrates how Customs and Border Protection officers use keen instinct and professional scientific analysis to intercept dangerous drugs being smuggled into our communities. In Cincinnati, Port Director Richard Gillespie heralded those singularly responsible for having kept this dangerous green powder out of our neighborhoods. Well, as you don't need to be told, beneath this righteous zeal was a farce worthy of Molière. The source of nicotine, of course, reported in the bust was ambile, a native paste that, with very high concentrations of tobacco, often used in conjunction with Mambe in the forest, an addictive and potentially lethal drug itself that when smoked is responsible for the death of 480,000 Americans every year. But of course, tobacco being legal, this substance was of no concern whatsoever to the customs agents. And the green powder in question was of course Mambe. And as early as 1957, Schultes had reported its use as a mild stimulant and essential component of the nutritional regime of all the peoples of the Northwest Amazon, whose daily consumption more than satisfied the recommended dietary allowance for calcium, iron, phosphorus, vitamin A, and riboflavin. And of course, this was prepared from an Amazonian variety of coca that we'll get to in a moment, with notably low concentrations of the alkaloid, less than 0.5% dry weight. Mambe is in fact as food as much as stimulant, as innocuous as a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and far better for the health. Now, the news report from WPVI noted that the green cocaine had been sent to labs in Savannah and Newark for analysis, but not reported were the actual results of the assays, trivial amounts of the alkaloid equivalent to the concentration of caffeine in a coffee bean. Had anyone tried to snort this powder, they would have simply plugged their nostrils most unpleasantly with a substance the consistency of talcum powder. Mambe, as you've noticed me using it around this conference, is always consumed orally. Now, to suggest that the smugglers might have sort of smuggled Mambe into the country in order to extract cocaine from it, even assuming that with all the ash in the preparation that could be done, makes about as much sense as importing Dom Perignon in order to extract ethyl alcohol. Like champagne, Mambe is a specialized item made by trained individuals on a small scale, a labor-intensive process that yields a highly valued and unique natural products. Drug cartels that have been smuggling cocaine hydrochloride into the country by the ton for years are not about to waste their time on it. In fact, what transpired at the airport in Philadelphia was a drug bust on par with Elliot Ness mistaking a truckload of potatoes for vodka and busting the works as a violation of the Volstead Act. And you know, you think about it, it's one thing to note, and you know, Andy Weil, who's going to be speaking after me, is just such a fountain of great lines, and I've stolen every one I can possibly steal over the years, but it was a long time ago that Andy noted that after 50 years of a war on drugs, there are more people in more places using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. It's one thing to recognize that, it's quite another to acknowledge that having spent billions of dollars on that misguided crusade, $1 trillion altogether, our frontline defenders still do not know the difference between a pure alkaloid first extracted as a drug in 1860 and Coca, a benign and highly nutritious plant revered today by millions of indigenous people and long celebrated for at least 8,000 years by all the ancient civilizations of South America as indeed the divine leaf of immortality. Well, new drugs have a way of upsetting the social order. The French Revolution was caused by caffeine, at least in part. That may sound crazy, but if you think about it, for generations, Europeans could not drink the water in any city if they didn't want to get cholera or amoebic dysentery. And so they drank spirits and mead and wine and beer. And of course, the alcohol took care of the pathogen problem, and so the entire continent was mildly besotted, which was fine as long as the main economic activities remained farming and handcrafted manufacturing. And then suddenly, over the course of just 3 decades, 3 botanical marvels arrived, all central nervous system stimulants, chocolate from Guatemala, tea from India and China, and of course coffee from Abyssinia, and eventually the New World. And all of these had to be made with boiled water, which solved the pathogen problem. And all of these were highly valued commodities that became dispensed in specialized places known as coffee houses. And these coffee houses became centers of both intellectual and political intrigue, attracting the likes of Voltaire and Rousseau, Isaac Newton, and Christopher Wren. And rather than hanging around in your local tavern with your brow and your beer, you were wired on caffeine and you couldn't shut up. And the writings of Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, if you really pay attention, Samuel Pepys, are absolutely infused with caffeine. And the coffee houses of London became known as penny universities, a reference to the cost of admission and the presence of the finest minds of the era engaged in open discourse and debate. But those of Paris became centers of intellectual intrigue and fountains of revolution, as equally talkative men took note of the fact that Versailles was a little bit bigger than their places. And in fact, the call to arms that led to the storming of the Bastille originated at the Café de Foy, Voltaire's favorite coffee house. And from there, the mob gathered and marched. Well, not surprisingly, those in charge tried their best to curtail the use of coffee, In 1633, the Sultan who ran the Ottoman Empire invoked the death penalty for all coffee drinkers, and he would dress himself up in the middle of the night in disguise and go through the streets of Constantinople, beheading anyone he could catch with the drink. Charles II, after the Restoration in England, shut down the coffee houses and eventually ordered them to stay closed. And as late as 1777, Frederick the Great of Germany, in this cartoon here, attempted to outlaw coffee that his people might return to beer, which yielded a more docile and manageable citizenry. But the problem was that a dull and passive workforce was in fact the last thing that the industrial economy emerging at the time needed. You could harvest a field after a few tumblers of beer, but hardly operate an unforgiving machine tool. And so along with steam and coal, coffee and tea fueled the Industrial Revolution, two stimulants that kept workers alert while providing rare moments of relief and satisfaction. A cup of tea became the salve for any crisis, and as we all know, the coffee break became institutionalized in every hall and assembly and church as a kind of brief but inviolable suspension of work, allowing employees to imbibe with predictable regularity another dose of the drug. And so coffee, initially employed exclusively as a medicine and only later serving as a spark of sedition, had by the 19th century become tamed and domesticated, in good measure because it allowed men and women to work and the industrial production to soar. Now, its pharmacology, its raw potential for good and evil, had not changed. A caffeine-crazed rat may even attack itself, ripping apart its own flesh. Humans do the same thing if they don't get coffee. The drugs, and so the drugs' undoubted potential for harm did not ultimately lead to its prohibition, because caffeine was deemed to be necessary, and thus its chemical essence was reconfigured and culturally redefined. And as a consequence, there is today no black market with extortionate prices that would bankrupt coffee drinkers and drive the most desperate of them to lives of crime, while delivering enormous profits to those in control of the dark trade. Instead, coffee is sold at prices that reflect a healthy and dynamic free market, generating both legitimate employment and tax revenues for countries and governments throughout the world. And what's more, the ready availability of the natural product, coffee beans and tea leaves in scores of flavors and blends, has effectively precluded the emergence of a significant market in chemical extracts of caffeine, which of course you all know is fortunate, because it's an axiom of pharmacology that the purer the drug, the greater the potential for abuse. Now, the first drug distilled in pure form from a plant was morphine, and cocaine followed in 1860. And the drug came into its own around 1884 when Karl Kohler, a close friend of Freud, recognized its anesthetic properties, which led to its first application in anesthesia. And as you know, to this day, cocaine remains our most important topical anesthetic, particularly for nose, throat, and ear surgery. Again, a perfect illustration of another of Andy's adages that there are no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are only good and bad ways of using drugs. And of course, the Corsican chemist Mariani came down on the good side in 1863 when he patented Vin tonique Mariani, a combination of red Bordeaux wine, coca leaf extract, and a sprinkling of pure cocaine. Needless to say, it was a hit. Mariani was responsible for 2 US presidents, 4 kings, 2 popes, 3 princes, 1 Russian czar, a shah, and the Grand Rabbi of France, all turning on to coke and coca and cocaine. Pope Leo XIII kept a flask of the wine on his hip at all times. The first man to fly across the English Channel was guzzling the stuff all the way. And among those who provided Mariani with testimonials were illustrious figures from H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Rodin, Ibsen, Sarah Bernhardt, the Prince of Wales. And of course, as the most popular prescribed medicine in the world, it inspired imitators. And in 1885, and you all know this story, John Pemberton, a pharmacist in Atlanta, registered a trademark for an alcoholic preparation, but aware of the imminent Harrison Pure Food and Drug Act that was at least on the horizon, and because of the interest at the time in mineral springs, he was smart and he removed the alcohol in acknowledgement of the temperance movement, and he added the kola nut of West Africa for more stimulation in caffeine. And then he replaced the water eventually with soda water because of the association with mineral springs. And he began to market this thing as an intellectual beverage and temperance drink. It was sold to another pharmacist in Atlanta, and the Coca-Cola company was launched. And it was sold as a treatment for a headache, a sovereign remedy. And one of the reasons that the soda fountain, those of us who are old enough to remember that in Woolworths there was always a soda fountain, like why was that in a pharmacy? It's because a soda fountain emerged as a kind of poor man's health spa. And the way you were originally asked for a Coke was not for the real thing, but to give me a shot in the arm. And so Coca-Cola became extraordinarily popular. And to this day, it's the only legal importer of coca leaves in the country. It goes to an industrial firm in New Jersey that extracts the cocaine for the legal pharmaceutical market, and yet the flavonoids and the other constituents go down to Atlanta. And it's this that, in fact, makes the Coca-Cola the real thing. And Coke doesn't like to admit this, but I don't know why they don't. But by the 1880s, Coca-Cola was marketed in hundreds of different, cocaine, hundreds of different products, sprays, injections, cocktails, cigarettes, and it was used for just about everything, including that scourge of the 19th century, female masturbation, for which one physician recommended a topical dose to the clitoris for prevention. And this wave of popularity peaked in 1884, the year that Freud published his misguided paper on Coca, and in which he suggested that cocaine could be a treatment for morphine addiction. And of course, as we all know, the treatment proved to be as bad as the ailment. And by 1890, there were over 400 cases of acute toxicity in the literature. And once the cocaine narcosis became clear, the reversal of fortunes was immediate and dramatic. And within a handful of years, cocaine went from being promoted as the most beneficial stimulant known to humanity, the tonic of choice of presidents and popes, to being seen as a modern curse, the embodiment of every social ill. And so cocaine was condemned as a narcotic, which it is not, and culturally marginalized as a symbol of decadence, employed only by artists, associated degenerates, and certainly most of them being conveniently black. And as physicians began to consider cocaine and morphine equally dangerous, there was a kind of association with opium and coca, as if coca was in fact as potentially hazardous as opium. And that's in a way how this plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for 8,000 years came to be viewed as it is not, as itself an addictive drug. But of course, coca is not cocaine, and to equate the leaf with the raw alkaloid is as misguided as suggesting that the delicious flesh of a peach is equivalent to the hydrogen cyanide found in every peach pit. Yet for nearly a century, this has been precisely the legal and political position of international organizations throughout the world. Now, the US government has long demonized the plant. It's incredible. In Peru, efforts to eradicate the traditional fields began 50 years before there was any kind of cocaine problem. It had nothing to do with the pharmacology of the alkaloid and everything to do with the cultural identity of those who revered the plant. And the call for eradication began with a series of physicians and bourgeoisie from Lima who looked up into the Andes, and their concern for Andean Indians was matched its intensity only by their ignorance of Andean life. And when they looked up into the mountains, and they saw abject poverty, illiteracy, poor health and nutrition, high rates of infant mortality. They searched for a cause, and because issues of economic injustice, land distribution challenged too closely the bourgeois foundations of their own lives, they settled on Coca as a scourge and the blame of all forms of social pathology. There was a man, there are any number of these individuals, but Carlos Enrique Paz Soldin, who was a university professor, raised one of the early battle cries in the 1920s: if we await with folded arms a divine miracle to free our indigenous population from the deteriorating action of Coca, we shall be renouncing our position as men who love civilization. And in the 1940s, these eradication efforts were led by this man, Carlos Gutierrez Noriega, who was the chief of pharmacology at the Institute of Hygiene in Lima. And he conducted a series of completely dubious experiments, all of which were driven by his conviction that the coca caused acute chronic mental alterations, and as well as behavioral disorders that he noted were absence of ambition. And the ideological thrust of his science was pretty obvious. In a report to the Peruvian Ministry of Public Education, he wrote, "The use of coca, illiteracy, and negative attitude toward the superior culture are all closely related." Well, it was because of his efforts that the United Nations dispatched these teams of experts in the fall of 1949 to look into the so-called coca problem, and they announced the results of their studies when they arrived at Lima and got off the plane. And the result were the findings became like the 1950 report on the Commission of Inquiry in the coca leaves, condemned the plant, called for its total eradication. And 11 years later, both Peru and Bolivia signed on to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, a treaty that again called for the complete eradication of coca chewing and coca leaf within 25 years. Now, incredibly, through all these years, from the 1920s or even beyond, all the way up until the mid-1970s, in the midst of all this hysterical condemnation of this plant, none of these public health officials did the obvious, a simple nutritional assay to see what the leaf actually contained. And when that was actually done by Andy Weil and Jim Duke and Tim Plowman in 1975, I think it was published, and I was very fortunate enough to serve as Tim Plowman's field assistant on the Coca project for 15 months in 74 and 75. And what Andy and Jim Duke and Tim found horrified our backers at the US government. It turns out that examining 15 nutrients found in the leaves and comparing their concentration with levels of the same nutrients in 50 common Latin American foods, coca was higher than the average in calories, protein, carbohydrate, and several minerals. It was full of vitamins, more calcium than any other plant ever assayed by science, particularly important for a traditional diet in the Andes that lacked a dairy product, and it even had enzymes in it which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, again, perfect for the tuber-based diet of the Andes. And so with that one simple assay showed that this was a plant that had been, as I said, used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, and was in fact a mild stimulant with a tiny amount of the alkaloid absorbed benignly in the mucous membrane, and that this plant had been a central part of Andean spiritual life, but also nutritional regime forever. And Andy, who is coming on after me, will go further into the medical benefits, and as he will tell you, we've only begun to scratch the surface of what this plant can do medicinally. But Andy himself would conclude in the midst of his studies of coca in that era that the plant was indeed a gift from the heavens, a sacred leaf intended only to better the lives of all people dwelling in all places on all the earth. Now, none of this will come as a surprise to anyone who's traveled in the Andes. When you work in the field in the morning, you sprinkle leaves. When you come home at night with the tools, you put blessings of the leaves upon the tools. Sacred rituals like the movimiento, where outside of Cusco, the fastest young boy is, in each hamlet, is given the honor of becoming a woman for the day. And he leads all able-bodied men on a run, but it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, run down 2,000 feet to the base of Antioquia, then you run to 16,000 feet and fall away over 2 more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a 24-hour run, which is less ritual than sacrifice. The idea is that you go into the mountain as an individual, but through exhaustion, and the word sacrifice comes from the Latin to make sacred, you emerge as a single pulse that has reaffirmed your sense of ownership and obligation to the earth. And at the age of 48, I became the only outsider and the oldest man ever to do this run, and I only got through the day by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 8,000-year history of the planet. But what really kept me was that I had baptized all these young kids and I'd raised them, and when they found out that their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they came out and they clung to me all day like limpets. They weren't going to let anything happen to their cash cow. But you know, even today, soothsayers or diviners in the Andes read the future in the coca leaves, but they have to have been struck by lightning to have the skill to do this. And if we go back into the no, we're stretching this out. No, I think we're going to have to stretch this out. You know, in the time of the Inca, you could not approach Yucoricancho if you didn't have coca in your mouth. Caravans carrying, you know, thousands of baskets of leaves regularly moved into the highlands from the lowlands. Armies were marched across the lengths of empire with coca. And of course, just as the Inca revered the plants, so did every other people, the Moche, the Chimu, Nazca, Paracas, all up and down the Quimbayo, the Muisca. This was literally the divine leaf of immortality. And the plant itself is a beautiful, if delicate, shrub with small white flowers and fruits the colors of rubies. And there are 2 cultivated species, the coca of Colombia, Coca erythroxylon novagranatense, and the coca of southern Peru, Erythroxylon coca, which Tim Plowman recognized 2 distinct varieties, including Coca Erythroxylon novagranatense variety trujiense, which is the coca of the northern deserts of Peru, the source of the coca used by Coca-Cola. And then curiously, the actual coca of the Colombian Amazon is Peruvian coca that was brought up and planted vegetatively in pre-Columbian times. Tim thought that because of morphological traits in novagranatense, that it was derived from Peruvian coca, but in new DNA work done since Tim passed on, a rather incredible thing has been revealed, that both of these sacred plants were independently domesticated thousands of miles apart from the same progenitor, Erythroxylon gracilipes, which grows all along the Andean Cordillera. So it's rare in botany for a plant to be plants of such significance to have a common ancestor, plants that were revered at all ends of the range. Now, when the Spanish arrived, of course, they banned coca until they realized that no one would work in the mines without it. So in 1573, Toledo made it legal, and it became the foundation of the Peruvian and Andean economy. On Potosi, incidentally, an average of 75 native people would die every day for 300 years. And coca became the foundation of the colony, and the early chroniclers were reverential about the plant. I mean, Garcilaso de la Vega said the leaf satisfies hunger, gives new strength to the weary and exhausted, makes the unhappy forget their sorrows. In the 19th century, one of the explorers of the Andes noted that he calculated that the people he was with consumed no less than 2,700 pounds of the leaves and yet remain in perfectly fine health. And some of these testimonials are so curious. The president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Sir Robert Christensen, in an experiment in Scotland, ran across the mountains with 10 students, 30 miles over hilly countryside, including an ascent of a prominent mountain. And he later wrote, "On arrival home before dinner, I felt neither hunger nor thirst, after complete abstinence from food and drink of every kind for 9 hours. But upon dinner appearing in half an hour, ample justice was done to it." He was 78 years old. And the greatest accounts come from the legendary W. Golden Mortimer, author of this great book, History of Coca. And he writes about a lacrosse match in Toronto. The Toronto club was composed of men accustomed to sedentary work, while some of the opposing players were sturdy men accustomed to out-of-door exercise. The games were all very seriously and severely contested, and some were played in the hottest weather of one summer. On one occasion, the thermometer registered 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun. The more stalwart appearing men were so far used up before the match was completed, they could hardly be encouraged to finish the game, while the coca chewers were as elastic and apparently free from fatigue as they were at the commencement of play. Well, Mortimer acknowledged coca as a panacea, noting its virtues as a medicine, but what really fascinated him was the subtlety of the action of the plant. It was a stimulant, to be sure, but at the same time, its subjective effect on the body was unlike that of any stimulant known to science. And as another doctor wrote in 1881, it's not a little remarkable that while no other known substance can rival coca in its sustaining power, no other has so little apparent effect. To one pursuing the even tenor of his usual routine, the chewing of coca gives no special sensation. In fact, the only result seems to be a negative one, an absence of the customary desire for food and sleep. And Andy captured this quality beautifully in an early description of his in 1973. He was with the Cubeo, and he was huddling with the men in the morning, and he wrote, "I found myself marching along in the column of Cubeos, swinging my machete, humming a tune, and feeling increasingly happy. The coca seemed stronger at this hour of the morning, and its warm glow spread from my stomach throughout my body. I felt a subtle vibrational energy in my muscles. My step became light, and there was nothing I wanted to do more than just what I was doing." Well, the difference between coke and cocaine, anthropologist Enrique Meyer once quipped, was the difference between traveling by donkey and jet plane. Now, it's a clever line, but one that misses an essential point. The actions of coca and cocaine are not comparable. Each gives a sense of well-being, but while cocaine assaults the senses, the effect of coca is moderated by any number of naturally occurring compounds. In fact, the preferred leaves in almost every culture, particularly in the Northwest Amazon, are always those with the least alkaloid within them. What's more, the cultures of coca and cocaine couldn't be more distant. What draws people to cocaine is the exotic decadence, the mystique of a rich man's drug, the ritual of a handful of people sneaking off into the shadows of a party to snort a few grains of a substance that these days could be just about anything. And inclusion in that circle is part of the expression of the secret society, because what's the point of being privileged if you can't flaunt the privilege publicly? And a lingering legacy of those cocaine culture of the 1980s is a small epidemic of hepatitis C contracted by those who in their youth somehow found it glamorous to stick up their noses a $100 banknote damp with the snot of a stranger. Coca, by contrast, is less a high than a meditation. Consumed in the Amazon as Mambe, in most of areas it's consumed as a whole leaf with some kind of alkali taken as an admixture. The elder brothers, the Arawakos and the Kogi and the Wiwa, gather seashells at the end of long ritual pilgrimages. For the sun priests of the Mamos, the chewing of hayo represents the most profound expression of culture. Their spiritual ideal is to refrain from sex, eating, and sleeping while staying up all night, chewing the leaves and chanting to the ancestors. As guardians of the world, they really believe that their prayers maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And every man consumes roughly a pound of leaves each day, beginning at marriage and continuing until their final breath. In the mountains of the southern Andes, distance is measured not in miles but in cocalas, the length of time and the number of chews a traveler requires for a journey. When men and women meet on the trail, they exchange quintus of leaves. 3 perfect leaves, as we saw in the previous speaker, arranged as a cross. They turn then to face the mountain deities, the apus that dominate the lives of all communities. And with eyes lifted toward the summit, they bring their leaves to the mouth and they blow softly a ritual invocation that sends the essence of the plant back to the earth, the community, the sacred places, the souls of the ancestors. The exchange of leaves is a social gesture. It's in a way of acknowledging a human connection. But the blowing of the puke is an act of spiritual reciprocity, for in giving selflessly to the earth, the individual ensures that in time the energy of the coca will return full circle. As the rain falls upon a field, will be reborn as a cloud. And that subtlety of gesture is in fact a prayer for the well-being of the entire world. And so the etiquette of halpai, which is the totality of the act of chewing coca, the exchange and salutations, the way one places leaves in the mouth, the attitude of reverence and respect, in a very real sense defines what it is to be runakuna, of a child of Pachamama. And as anthropologist Catherine Allen writes, one cannot function in the Andes as a social being unless you partake in the ritual, and you must do it properly. Nothing offends the people more than tourists and travelers who stuff their mouths with leaves like horses eating hay. And whether the leaves are taken in the presence of a friend or a stranger alone, to chew coca is to transcend self and become part of the social, moral, and spiritual nexus that in the Andes gives meaning to life. Coca alone makes possible direct communication with the divine. The first to touch the leaves, some say, was Santissima Maria, the mother of Christ, who lost her child and chewed the leaves to allay her grief. And the point is that for the people of the Andes, to be without coca is a form of social and spiritual death. It's an excommunication from life itself. So efforts to deny the traditional people access to the leaves, to eradicate the traditional fields, are not analogous to outlawing, for example, beer in Germany or betel in Indonesia or even tea in China. These in the Andes are policies of cultural genocide. Now, the war on drugs began in 1971, as you know, when Richard Nixon took hold of fear and turned it into a political movement. He couldn't care less about drugs, as John Ehrlichman's memoir made clear. He concocted the crisis strictly as a political ploy to galvanize his base ahead of the re-election campaign in 1972. At that time, most Americans had never heard of cocaine, and those who had simply, carried it in their body orifices from Salvador to Peru while they went surfing. Nobody had any idea how sordid the trade would become. Well, today, more than 50 years on, more cocaine is being produced and trafficked than ever before. And I was putting together a talk for the Hay Festival on the book that Dennis mentioned, Magdalena. All these photographs you're about to see are really from that story. But as I was doing that this morning, I realized every face you're about to see has suffered. Either a massacre in their village, a murdered family member, a kidnapped family, or driven into exile. And in the United States, we know that because of the war on drugs, it's the only country with more prison residents than college graduates. But in Colombia, an actual war that would not have lasted for a day without the illicit traffic of cocaine has killed 260,000 people. 7 million people internally displaced, 5 million people forced to leave their homes. How would you feel as Americans if Canada had patterns of drug consumption in bars and boardrooms across the country, laws that facilitated a black market, but sanctions that did nothing to curtail the trade, such that 85 million Americans would be driven from their homes? Well, that's what happened in Colombia. In the last year before the Acuerdo, the peace agreement, the FARC were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly kids in search of food. And they nevertheless made $600 million US dollars that year in extortion and drug trafficking. You give me the Boy Scouts of Beverly Hills and $600 million US dollars, and I can wreak havoc in Southern California. In the early days of the cartel, Escobar was putting 80 tons of cocaine into America every month. The cartel in Medellin budgeted every week 1,000 US dollars to buy elastic bands just to wrap the money in. And yet these are the faces of the Colombians who have suffered. And yes, it has become Colombia's curse, but the engine driving the train has always been consumption. The cartels rose out of the barrios and country clubs of Medellin and Cali, but ultimate responsibility for Colombia's agonies lies in good measures with every person you've ever known who has ever bought or used illicit cocaine, and every foreign nation that has made possible the illicit trade by prohibiting the drug while doing nothing to curb its use in any serious way. Now, even were the complete removal of the plant to be desirable, which it's not, it's unlikely that Colombia or Peru could do so because the financial incentives for small family farmers are too big, their growing area is too vast and inaccessible, and crop substitution programs are delusional. Coca produces 3 crops a year. You can bring it down to free base and carry it to market in a mochila. Many of these farms have no road access, and there's no way of getting the product to market. Juan Manuel Santos, a Nobel laureate from 2016, served as Minister of Defense under Uribe and later 2 terms as Colombia's president. No one in the world, he once told me, has done more to eradicate more coca than he, and he recognizes it all now as having been an absolute disastrous thing to do. The war on drugs has been a grotesque failure. It's blackened the name and the promise and robbed us of one of the most beneficial plants known to botanical science. This is what we need to do. Stop saying what coca is not. Coca is not a drug. Coca is not cocaine. And actually turning back coca to what it is, this incredibly beneficial plant. You know, Barbara Tuchman defined folly as when a nation in full possession of the facts nevertheless acts against its own self-interest. The war on drugs is the biggest folly in the history of public policy. It's a misguided crusade, as idiotic as the original crusades, and we know how they ended up. But you know, we remain stuck for a simple reason, and something that I only came to understand many years ago when I returned from South America, having worked with Tim Plowman. There was a job available at the USDA that Tim wanted me to apply for, but he told me if I took the job, he'd kill me. And intrigued, I went out to Beltsville, Maryland, found the office of this corporate official, knew immediately he had nothing to do with the USDA. He was DEA from head to toe. First thing I noticed about him is that he was a drug addict. I couldn't get into the office for the cigarette smoke. The second thing I noticed is the entire walls were covered with seized paraphernalia. It was like going into the office of an anti-pornographer and seeing the walls papered with pornography. And then I'm looking at this guy, and it's the 1970s. He's got red hair, hairy chest, a big butterfly collar, gold chains around his neck, gold on his wrist. I'm thinking, where have I seen this guy? And what all he had distilled from our research is that Tim and I were good at finding coca fields. So we wanted me to go back to South America, get the biological pests that predate on coca, bring them back so they could be manipulated and reintroduced as a form of biological terrorism. And as I'm looking at this guy, I'm thinking, where have I seen you before? I know you. And I lived in Medellin when the cartel emerged. And I realized, I don't know you literally. I've met you 1,000 times in the streets of Medellin, because you are the cartel, you son of a bitch. You know, the energy was exactly the same. I left that office absolutely convinced that they were 2 sides of the same coin. And this is our problem. Neither of the principal antagonists in the war on drugs have the slightest interest in winning that war. The DEA gets $60 billion every year. That would evaporate. If cocaine was legalized, these obscene profits that allow the blood of Colombian people to flow like rivers in their country would disappear as well. Well, needless to say, I did not take that job, but somebody did. 25 years later, after Tim had revealed the wonder of this plant to the world, The US approved the use of a novel fungus, Fusarium oxysporum, developed by scientists at the USDA with the specific goal of wiping out coca wherever the plant was found. They also experimented with a moth, Floria noesii, known in the Amazon as the gringo because of its voracious consumption of coca. All of this would have been implemented if Bill Clinton didn't cut it off because he knew that Latin American countries would see it as a form of biological terrorism. So having been frustrated on one front, the Americans turned to the air and they began to spray the fields with Roundup. And from 1990, the US contractors sprayed Roundup over 4.4 million acres. Their herbicide killed plant life indiscriminately. One scholar who worked on the program reported that it did absolutely nothing to curtail production, and it only forced the cartel deeper into the forest where more primary forest would be destroyed. In 2015, Santos curtailed that program out of concern for the well-being of both biodiversity in Colombia, but more importantly, the children of Colombia. And yet today, 2019, cocaine production is higher than ever before. And even as Colombia has struggled, with 2 million Venezuelan refugees who didn't get put into cages, they came across that border, they were housed, fed, given medical attention, put in school, even allowed to work, at a time when Colombia needed $45 billion to pay for the 578 conditions of the peace agreement, even as oil prices collapsed. So in a point of incredible need, where every peso counted, Colombia opened its arms to its neighbor in a way that no nation state in the Americas has ever done. And so what did the United States government do? They threatened to withhold $500 million of promised aid unless the Colombians began to spray their fields again with Roundup. And so today, that is what indeed has going on. As one person commented, the drug war has tried in vain to keep cocaine out of people's noses, but could result instead in scorching the lungs of the earth. So the point, finally, is that it's time to find another way. Rather than yielding to American pressure to expand the aerial use of herbicides, why not ask why any of Colombia's biodiversity, its greatest asset, not to mention the health and well-being of its children, should be put to risk to satisfy the misguided policies of a foreign country whose people want to use this shitty drug. And having endured the consequences of the trade for so many years, maybe it's time for Colombia to reclaim a stolen legacy by celebrating coca for what it really is and what the Incas saw it to be. Marketed as a tea, perhaps a chewing gum, the sacred plant could be Colombia's greatest gift to the world, dwarfing the commercial success of coffee in good measure because coca is just so much better a product. Just think about it. Just do a little thought experiment. Wouldn't you like this? Who wouldn't want to experience a sense of enhanced energy and mental clarity, a mild suppression of hunger, a gentle feeling of creative confidence, a lightness to one's step lasting throughout the day, knowing that the source of your slight elevation of mood was a benign and highly nutritious plant, a leaf that had been revered by the peoples and great civilizations of South America for 5,000 years. In a digital economy where work for so many of us implies long hours staring at screens, what could be more welcome or promising than a natural product that facilitates focus and concentration, even while inducing a subtle sense of contentment and well-being? Truth be told, coca is the ideal companion for any creative endeavor, be it the writing of poetry or code, composing music, or simply basking in the silence of the stars. Those who experience coca invariably come away astonished by its subtle yet pleasant effects and its practical use. Coca works, and it works for everybody in idiosyncratic ways. I'm a writer cursed with a frenetic travel schedule, and coca allows me to take a seat on an airplane after a busy day and return immediately to the task at hand, picking up right where I left off in a text, watching as the words flow from these fingers, oblivious to all distractions. Now, as Andy will tell us, at the moment coca is Schedule 2, which means that it can technically be prescribed by a doctor, but the problem is there's no supply and there are no established protocols. And yet here we have marijuana, Schedule 1, legal in 40 countries, and all these psychedelics, also Schedule 1, at the forefront of this new revolution in therapy. So this really has to change. If we can decouple coca from cocaine and bring out a series of products that are not decocanized but have the real thing in it, you want to get liftoff. Because there are 130,000 Colombian families who grow the plant, and they don't have anything else to do. And the liberation of the leaves will both undermine the black market trade and reduce deforestation by opening up for cultivation lands long ago cleared and abandoned. And through taxation, it will generate for Colombia the revenues that will allow a long-suffering nation to pay the price of peace, having drained its treasury for 50 years to pay the costs of a war only made possible by the sordid profits of prohibition. And we're not alone on this quest. Colombia is on side, as are the people of Peru and Bolivia. And when coca is legalized, the first step perhaps of legalizing all drugs, then we'll be able to look back not only the gift of Colombia, but to the incredible contribution of this man, Tim Plowman, who died too young, but told us the story of coca in a way that had never been told before. I'm sorry to go on so much, but I really wanted you to know something real about coca after the initial presentation.